Okay, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to this session. My name's Gus O'Donnell. I am the former Jeremy Hayward. If you saw Jeremy at the start introducing the session, he's now got my job. I am now a member of the House of Lords, our second chamber, and doing various other jobs, including chairing an economics consultancy, Frontier Economics, which does behavioural economics to the private sector and also helps on public sector issues. So the first message I have for all of you is congratulations. You have chosen the right session, right? I just met my colleague Nick Stern, who's giving a parallel session on climate change, and we've worked together on that for a long time. But this is the important session in the sense of you have heard lots from brilliant people about the ideas of behavioural economics, behavioural insights, behavioural science, whatever we're going to call it. This is how do you turn it into practice. So if you don't do this, then all those wonderful ideas will go to waste. Nothing will change. So this is where it really matters. I feel very well qualified to do this because I was there when we set up the Behavioural Insights team as Cabinet Secretary. And of course, Gus is short for Augustine. Now, those of you who will have been at Dan's session will know, he talked about confession and Catholics. Well, Augustine was a very early, St. Augustine, very early behavioral economist, right? His prayer was based on present bias and hyperbolic discounting. It was, Lord, give me chastity, but not yet, okay? So, I've got you smiling, which is what Bob said we had to do first of all. And the other way of thinking about this is that you had some really intelligent ideas, really intelligent people like Danny telling you that it has to be fun, and that's really important. But here we need to turn it into reality. We have a lot of intelligent people, a lot of intelligence there, and as my mother always told me, intelligence is like underwear, okay? Very important to have it, not necessary to always show it off, okay? So we have a number of people here who are going to combine the ideas of brilliance and making it into a reality. We are going to have this in two parts. So the first part will be a number of speakers who will talk about, having done it in their countries and in their institutions, how we institutionalize brilliant ideas, how we set up behavioral insights teams, and how we get the academics and the practitioners working together. We'll then have a panel session. Then we will move to 3 more speakers who will come and give us ideas from around the world. And then we will have given you lots. And remember, as we learned from Bob, reciprocity, we will have given a lot in advance, and then you will give back by asking lots of interesting questions of the audience. And then we will go away incredibly happy. I should have said there won't be any fire things happening, and if they do, oh my God, just run. It's probably not the phrase I was given, but that's the idea. So our speakers that are going to come up, first of all, Owen Service. Owen, Owen the beard, basically, the mobile beard, you've seen him already, head of BIT. These are going to be very short intros because I want you to hear them. Varun, Gauri, World Bank, the man behind the World Development Report, all that sort of stuff, tell you about development space. Andrea, the wonderful Andrea. Andrea and I met when we were talking about behavior change and well-being in Germany. She is the brains behind what's happening in Germany in Chancellor Merkel's office. She's going to tell us about that. And Sitkin, professor from Duke, is going to explain to us the relationship between academics and how we would kind of get the underpinnings right for all of this. So we're going to start off with Maya Shankar from the White House. Now, Maya has hurt her back, so she can't be here. She couldn't make the first one of these sessions, so I'm kind of thinking there's something going on here. I mean, she needs to change her behavior somewhat. I think she's changed things such that her third time she'll be lucky because it will be in the US at Harvard, so maybe she'll make it there. So Maya's going to start off with a video, and cue video.
Greetings from Washington, D.C. I'm Maya Shankar, Senior Advisor for the Social and Behavioral Sciences at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. and chair of the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team. I'm joined today by one of my co-founders, Will Tucker, who is a fellow on the team. Thank you to our hosts for showing this brief video during the event. We wanted to send our regrets for not being there in person for what I'm sure will be an excellent conference. We wanted to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about the White House Social and Behavioral Sciences team and to share some of the exciting developments we're seeing in the space. Our team is a cross-agency initiative chaired by the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy with representatives from a dozen agencies across the federal government, as well as offices within the Executive Office of the President. Our mission is to translate findings and methods from the social and behavioral sciences into improvements in federal policies and programs for the benefit of the American people.
Federal agencies operate with defined missions and objectives and execute policies and run programs to achieve these objectives, from national defense to caring for the elderly, from supporting students to access and complete college, to ensuring the fairness and transparency of consumer markets. Our team works together with agencies to identify how insights from the social and behavioral sciences can be used to help agencies better achieve those missions and objectives, and in cost-effective ways. Our team also helps agencies, where relevant, rigorously test the impact of its behavioral recommendations on program outcomes, using randomized controlled trials where possible and accessible. And where these projects demonstrate successful results, they provide a basis for agencies to scale the results to future or more widespread agency efforts. That said, we have a policy of reporting results from all projects we run, even when they don't produce statistically significant results. Our commitment to transparency stems from the fact that it is just as valuable to learn what works as it is to learn what doesn't.
The Social and Behavioral Sciences team builds on a long tradition of the U.S. government applying scientific insights to policy and recruiting scientific and technical talent into government. We've also built on the work of pioneering agencies in the U.S. who have established a precedent of applying behavioral insights to improve program and policy outcomes, such as the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Labor. It's been more than a decade since Richard Thaler first held a session called Memos to the Council of Behavioral Economic Advisors that argued for a centralized federal group focusing on behavioral economics. We're excited to see a group of this kind here in the U.S.
We've also learned a lot from conferences like these. We've learned, of course, from large sessions, but also from informal conversations where we've been able to compare notes with researchers and policymakers about how to best identify opportunities and get projects across the finish line, and what cutting-edge concepts from the scientific community might be applied to policy.
We think it's an extremely exciting time to be applying behavioral science to public policy. First, there is incredible potential for dedicated innovation teams. The past decade has seen the kind of impact governments from across the world can have when they establish teams that bring the latest science and innovation into government. In the U.S., for example, the Presidential Innovation Fellows have brought the innovation economy into government by pairing talented, diverse technologists and innovators with top civil servants and change makers within the federal government to tackle some of our nation's biggest challenges. And we hear that there are as many as 50 teams of applied behavioral scientists within governments around the world.
Second, we've seen how different types of collaborative relationships between the behavioral science research community, policymakers, and institutions can evolve over time. What may start off as a single one-off project between a government and a researcher can develop into a more sustained relationship between that government and some hometown universities, with professors and graduate students taking tours of duty on government teams for a year or more. Third, we're seeing the potential that behavioral insights can have in a broad range of policy areas, and also the contributions that they can make in informing policy reform efforts at scale.
And finally, right now we are all seeing the potential benefits of bringing together researchers, scientists, and policy officials from around the world on this agenda. As we've said, we've found similar events and discussions with leadership from countries around the world to be invaluable in the past. We'll look forward to seeing you next year when the Behavioral Exchange is hosted in the U.S. We look forward to sharing results as we have more to share. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. And now, without any ado, I'll pass up to Owen to give you the news from the UK.
Thanks, guys. Thanks, Gus. It's always entertaining hearing Gus talking about his name, because when Gus was Cabinet Secretary, everybody used to refer to him as Gus O'Donnell or God, which gives you some some idea of his importance back then as now, because Gus also also chairs academic advisory panel, for which we are incredibly grateful. Institutionalizing behavioural insights is a subject which is really, really close to my heart, largely because back in 2010, when we set up the Behavioural Insights team, I still remember the answer phone message on my mobile phone from David Halpern, who I previously worked with in what was then the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. He said, could we have a chat to talk about this new role on this exciting new team? And effectively, David's role was always going to be thinking the big ideas, basically coming up with amazing, brilliant new ways of thinking about behavioural science and applying it in practice. And my role back then was thinking about how we could set the team up in a way that could give it traction within government. And that's really what the topic of this talk is now. So I thought what I'd do is I'd talk about two different things, but they're obviously interconnected. The first is different ways in which you can run and establish behavioural insights projects in your governments back home. And then the second, 6 lessons which lie at the heart of Inside the Nudge Unit, which I'd obviously wholeheartedly recommend you go buy after this session if you haven't already, based obviously around an acronym, because we are the Behavioural Insights team, we love acronyms. So 3 basic options for undertaking behavioural insights pieces of work. Basically, you can either just run a project on a specific theme, you can establish some kind of network, or you can set up a central unit. I'll just talk a little bit about each of those. So the first is just undertake a behavioural insights project on any given policy area. And in some respects, this is actually what happened in the UK. So if you think about some of the examples that have been given over the past couple of days, principal amongst them being automatic enrolment onto pensions, there was no behavioural insight team. It was an idea that could be applied to a specific program area. Similarly, at the moment, in places like Guatemala, we're working with the government there on a specific project, namely around using some of the ideas that we've been applying on tax in the UK to tax in Guatemala. And we're doing that in partnership with the World Bank. So I think a lot of people at this conference might think, let's just jump in and let's set up a new function. You don't have to do that. In some respects, it's worth dipping your toe into the waters of behavioural insights by setting up a project on a specific theme before you go any further. The second is to think about it, rather than establishing a central unit, to think about it in more of a networked approach. And lots of governments around the world are doing this at the moment. So rather than establishing a central team and a central government department, there are often moves in particular areas to establish teams in different departments. And again, in the UK, we have a cross-government network of practitioners who link up the actions of different teams. And that's also the case in countries like Singapore, where the Prime Minister's office has a coordinating role but doesn't have a big central government team. So I think it's sort of worth thinking about that as an alternative too. But we would obviously recommend also thinking about establishing a central unit. And I'll just talk a bit about what we think of as the 6 core conditions for establishing a successful central unit at the heart of government. And we like to think that other governments are sort of learning from these lessons too. And the acronym or the mnemonic is APPLES, which interestingly at a Harvard conference last year provoked a whole plethora of different fruit-based analogies. So I'm hoping that the speakers that follow me will do something similar. So the first is administrative support. You need to get the buy-in of the administration within which you're functioning. Gus was absolutely central from that point of view. The second is politics. So you need to, at the very least, think about how your work connects with the political narrative of the government of the day, if not having the backing of the Prime Minister, which is also obviously helpful. Third, most importantly, you need to think about people. And you need to think about blending the academic with those who really understand the institutions of the government of the day. Don't just go in as an academic to a government institution and think that everybody is going to listen to you because you know what the answer is. You need people who understand how the corridors of power operate in practice. That is, I think, the number one lesson. Fourth, location. Geography is important. Those conversations that you have in the margins of meetings, the people that you bump into, they're critically important. Fifth, experimentation. At this conference now, it seems obvious that experimentation was at the heart of the approach that we put in place at BIT. It wasn't obvious back then. It was something that we built into our practice because we felt that making what seemed like relatively small changes required us to be able to show the demonstrable impact of those changes. And then lastly, scholarship. So scholarship, collaboration with academics is crucially important and something that we've embedded at the heart of our model. And taking all of those things into one, blending them all together, I think points in two directions. Firstly, you need to make yourself very useful in the actions that you take. And secondly, it's all about collaboration and partnership. And I will end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Owen. Okay, next we have Varun. So is he going to do pears to follow the apples? Thinking about it?
I'm thinking.
Okay. Purely economic and what?
When you give a talk and you're somewhat nervous, we've all been told to imagine your audience wearing underwear, but thanks to Gus, I'm a little bit confused now because I think it might be the reverse. When the World Bank kicks off an agenda, it has begun, by devoting its flagship report, the World Development Report, to that topic. The 1993 report on health inaugurated work in health and health lending for the World Bank. The 1997 report on the state kicked off an agenda on governance, which is now a large part of World Bank work. The 2011 World Development Report focused on conflict. The realization was that many of the poorest countries in the world suffer from conflict, and we have to be able to both prevent it and work in those environments. In 2013, a decision was made to begin thinking about behavioral economics, social psychology, and what those fields mean for development. There was a sense that a lot is already happening in this area. The World Bank worked on social capital. Microfinance groups rely on social connections among people. Simplification was a big part of the agenda. So, customary law and social norms were very top of mind for many development practitioners. But there was a sense that these fields weren't talking to each other. They weren't rooted in a common theoretical foundation. They weren't necessarily drawing on the latest methods, experimental methods, in behavioral economics and psychology. And so it was time to take the next step. After the decision was made to write a report on this topic, the first challenge we encountered was a series of questions about why this makes sense for a development agency. There were 5 questions. The first was, most of the work in these fields are on students in universities in the global north. What does this mean for development? The second question was, this is all good and fine, getting people to pay their taxes on time, but tell me, as Ravi Kanbor put it, why is China China? Like, that's really the big development question. What can you tell us about that? Third, there are lots of these biases, but in market settings, they're less important. There's arbitrage in markets that wash these away. Fourth question was, if you talk about the mindsets of people who are poor, aren't you blaming the poor for their own poverty? There was a real fear that we would one day see a headline that says, World Bank says poverty rises because people are stupid. And we didn't want a headline like that. Finally, the journalism question. We went ahead and wrote the report. I encourage you to download it, of course, it's free. In the report, we talk about a model for the decision maker. There are lots of ways to think about behavioral economics, but in our story, in our framework, people think automatically. This is the Kahneman-Tversky kinds of approach. People think socially, and they think with mental models. We applied this framework to a variety of sectors: household finance, education, early childhood education, health, poverty, climate change. Then we, in conclusion, presented the results of a survey we applied to World Bank staff themselves to get a sense of our own biases. And we also talked about what this means, particularly in terms of adaptation and testing in the field. So we needed to answer those questions, and we argued that these things apply to big problems too, like corruption and climate change. We had surveyed World Bank staff to say it's not just the poor, but we ourselves who suffer these problems, potentially. We conducted surveys in countries in the Global South to see whether these biases existed there. After the report was done, we did a dissemination program in 20, 25 countries. We received some good press. We talked about it a lot. Then we got the authorization. Now we have the authorization to go forward. We're setting up a Behavioural Insights team, although we need a new name because that one's taken. And we're going to go forward on some of the big questions. Sanitation behavior in South Asia, road safety, 1.25 million people die in road accidents each year, more than the number of people that die from violence and conflict combined, twice that amount who die from violence and conflict combined. Tax compliance and what people call a new social contract with the government, and finally water conservation and socio-emotional skills. We'll see where we go. The model is to work with World Bank project teams as well as directly with governments. And if I have to come up with an acronym, I would say knowledge, authorizing environment, action, KAA. It's not quite a fruit, but I think it ought to be a fruit. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Andrea, you're going to take us through the German experience.
Offer any apple or any kind of fruit. Also, as an economist, I would say there's no such thing as a free fruit. So, Owen, what is it you expect from us? We are really very young in the club, so there's not a lot of advice we can give, but what I can do is explain what we do in Germany. There's a long story behind how we got there. Don't worry, I won't start 10 years ago, but just show one source of why we set up a unit is a couple of years ago we had a national dialogue on Germany's future, and many experts independently from each other told us we need to strengthen our evaluation culture and do more ex-post evaluation. We were looking into that and thought that that's interesting, but it's not the whole story. We really need to start sooner. We really need to look, where do ideas come from? Where is the support system for testing ideas and so on? So we came up with an approach that is tailor-made to the German situation and to where the public service in Germany is at. And the chancellor immediately liked the idea, so it was a matter of a couple of minutes to explain the idea of what we call an ex-ante impact assessment. And what we mean by that is that we want to go deeper into a qualitative understanding of problems and situations. What we most have is quantitative, is data, but a qualitative understanding really of speaking to all the agents involved, citizens, but also different agencies and so on. And from that more causal research, going into a user-led perspective, developing ideas, testing them in RCTs. We do more research kind of projects that have like longer terms, 1 or 2 years. Testing the alternatives and testing them with clear-cut, targeted solutions in order to strengthen a target-oriented, outcome-oriented politics as well. And then also accompany the implementation and do an ex-post evaluation along. So we really have a learning circle from the beginning of finding ideas till the ex-post evaluation and talk to our colleagues in the offices all along the process, have an iterative learning cycle. So the Chancellor put it into the coalition treaty, and here we could go. We now have a cabinet minister we're working with who's also in charge of deregulation, simplification. Our Office for National Statistics just did a huge survey on citizen satisfaction in different phases of life to see where's difficulties, where are they dissatisfied with the services we deliver. And only in February now, we hired 3 scientists who come from different fields, an interdisciplinary team where we were looking, first of all, at the empirical knowledge, knowing how to do RCTs, but also qualitative interviews and so on. And they have a sound understanding of behavioral studies and social sciences in general. So we set this team up in the staff for policy planning, which is important to see, so it underlines the importance, it opens up the access to all the departments, it ensures that they talk to us in the first place. Then it's a matter of building up trust, whether they really are willing to cooperate. And this is where we go. We say attraction rather than promotion. Who really wants to work with us? There we go. We presented, first of all, examples of what's done around the globe and in different units to senior management in order to illustrate where we want to go and ask all the different departments, give us some ideas. What are the projects where you would need this kind of input, of developing ideas together, how to tackle problems, and then test them. Now then, we, with our scientists, we were talking to all these different departments and seeing whether the projects can be done. So we really follow the strict demand following approach in order to make sure that cooperation is really there and try to find tailor-made answers. It's like we bring research inside the departments, but do it tailor-made. You always have this gap between applied research and the practical implementation in public service, so we kind of close this gap in this way. Our focus is really on the benefit of citizens first. We did a lot of deregulation in the business area. Here we concentrate on benefit for citizens first. And our aim is to empower citizens. So to get rid of blockages, provide better information at the right time, in the right way, so they can make their decisions based on their preferences. How do we assess projects? First of all, we look at benefit for citizens and do they empower, yes or no? But also we look at relevance. Is this a real relevant political problem? Is the political goal legitimate? Is it somewhere in the coalition treaty, for example? So we don't make up goals ourselves. They're there firsthand. What are the impact, the outcome, but also what is the stability of the effect we expect. We don't want one-term effects, we want sustainable effects. And then feasibility. Is the data really available? We have very strict data privacy rules in Germany, and very often we have fantastic projects, but then we can't work with the data, or the data is not allowing us to do an RCT. So something else has to step in at the moment. So we combine a citizen-centered politics with evidence-based politics, but also an outcome-oriented politics in that way. And what we expect from that is to get sure, clear empirical evidence, higher impact of policies and overall effectiveness, strengthening evidence-based policies. But what we really want is, in the long run, establish feedback samples of knowledge, a real knowledge management system and a support system for public servants who face a lot of demands these days, of managing complex problems, of high uncertainty, wicked problems, complex cross-sectional topics, and so on. So creating a support system for that. And for sure, all of this in order to deliver better services, higher satisfaction of citizens, and better regulation and all. We hope that we are confident that we can prove the contribution of this approach within the next 2.5 years. That's the time we got, and then we have elections, and we'll see. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Now we have Professor Sam Sitkin, Professor of Management at Duke University, who's going to bring together the academic, the organization, the whole bit.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. What I want to focus my remarks on is what I see as a gap that needs to be filled in order to sustainably institutionalize the behavioral insights work that's been done so admirably over recent years. While I may have been invited just so Owen wouldn't feel isolated in having a beard, I would like to comment on the fruit. I'm not going to offer a fruit, but I will offer an analogy that's relevant to the fruit, which is if you want to have fruit grown sustainably, you need some form of irrigation. And I'm going to use as a metaphor here a water analogy, that you can think about the basic and applied research that's been done so well in recent years, especially, as providing the opportunity for clean water. This morning, we were able to consume water. We were able to take showers in clean water. Not everybody across the world has that luxury. How does the water get from lakes that have clean water, from rivers that have clean water, to our bathrooms, to our kitchens, so we can use it? We need to have what we refer to as essential infrastructure, essential sustainable infrastructure, to get that water in a reliable way. Our societies have really changed based on the ready availability of clean water. We now assume it in many Western countries, but we can't assume it. We need to make sure that infrastructure is present. We need to make sure that the research that's being done is simple in how it's conveyed, is accessible, it's routinized, it's routinely accessible, and that it is inexpensive to access. Those are the issues that I'm going to raise. Many of today's speakers and yesterday's speakers spoke about issues that are related to the notion of institutionalizing what we're doing by talking about institutions that routinely create the research. In basic research, it's universities. In terms of applied research, it's the Behavioral Insights team and many of the other organizations that we've heard from have now institutionalized the way we can more routinely produce the research. We've also heard, and the examples of Germany and the World Bank are illustrations of this, how we've institutionalized aspects of this work to get it implemented in the organizations that then can carry it forward. The creation of Behavioral Insights teams around the world would be an example of that. That, to me, is analogous to having the water, which is the basic, and in some cases applied research. And if we go, I may be pushing the analogy a little too much, if we think about the faucets in our bathrooms, the faucets in our kitchen, the shower heads that let us take the shower, the infrastructure within our homes and our businesses that allow us to have clean water, that's the implementation part of it. The question is, how do you get the water from here to there so that we can use it in a way that we don't even notice how it got there? We need that infrastructure if all of the efforts that we're exerting are going to be sustainable. Now, what I'm talking about here, and this is why the irrigation for the fruit is I think, an apt analogy, is we need pipes. We need systems for reviewing and cleaning the data to get that water from one place to another. What's the analogy there in terms of the research that we're talking about? Much as government and business organizations have started to institutionalize this within their organizations, what we're missing is routine, easy-to-use ways of accessing and moving that data. What are those ways that we need? We would argue that there are three kinds of aspects. One is creating readily accessible portals for the information. Searchable databases, ways to easily access the great work that's been done in other parts of the world, in other industries, in other organizations. Creating publications that make it easy for academics to disseminate new findings and for practitioners to easily find it, whether it's on an online database or in publications. Creating matchmaking interfaces such that those who can do the science and those who need it can be joined much more easily. Matching researchers to organizations and identifying these kinds of linkages. Building shared communities, not in general. A conference like this is great for building a broader community, but what we need is specific communities around specific problem areas where scientists, practitioners, funders, and others are brought together to really sustainably create not only the databases, but the network of relationships to identify and address the necessary problems. So we need community, we need portals, and we need matchmaking interfaces. To end, what I'd like to note is there are organizations that are doing this. One example we were talking about earlier is there are new initiatives that sometimes go under the label of things like What Works. Those are examples of how to make it easier to find best practices. Someone else has solved the problem that you're interested in. Someone else has used the research that you think could have great application. That's one example. But how easy is it to systematically find where is the science that would relate to my problem? Not just where's the solution, but where's the science? Where are the researchers who can help me solve that problem? We have a bunch of those institutions that already exist, whether it's the Behavioral Insights team, Ideas 42, a bunch of other organizations. We have institutions like what's happening at the World Bank, what's happening in the White House Social and Behavioral Science team, what's happening in Germany as an illustration. What we need is a bridge between those. The Behavioral Science and Policy Association, which is a group I created, its mission is to create the publications, the archive, the community building networks, and so forth. We need many more organizations like that in order to provide the essential infrastructure to make the pieces of institutionalization that we've already done stick, not just be episodic. So 10 years from now, we don't look back at this conference as the heyday of behavioral science implementation, but more as the start of a much more major movement because we've made it sustainable. Thank you.
Great. Well, we now have a chance to have a discussion amongst the panel, but the one point I think I'd like to get across, putting on my old hat as Cabinet Secretary, is, and I think the analogy I can use for you, you'll all have done this. So I started life as an academic, and you're either in the situation of having sat exams or having actually had to, as Nick, work out what the questions are. And the interesting thing is quite often the questions are exactly the same, it's just the answers that change, right? Now the question that I kind of was thinking about in my head was, you take the example that you've all heard so many times, the one about tax letters, where we've just put in that extra sentence saying, 90% of the people. So why do you do that? So I'd say the undergraduate answer to that is you do it because you're using social norms to try and improve things, right? The postgraduate answer to that, which I'm hoping you're picking up now, is, no, this is very clever. This is getting the Ministry of Finance bought in because you're raising some revenue. So you're working your government, right? That's the postgrad master's level. The PhD level is, no, you missed the point. The point about this is one example of a communication that government is making with the public. If you listen to Steven Pinker, you'd have said, aha, okay. If you start to change the way all of government communicates with the public and they have a behavioral mindset in there, boy, you're going to make a big difference. Which is why the question I want to put to some of the panel is does a Behavioural Insights team on its own change things, or how do you kind of get the whole mindset built into not just the government, but also the people doing the research as to how do they actually write policies for humans as opposed to econs? So, Owen, do you want to?
Yeah, so I think it's a really good point. For me, what's changed most over the past couple of years is that we've moved from precisely that situation of there is a central unit doing interesting things and focusing on specific areas of policy to a world in which every single government department, with a couple of exceptions in the UK, has got its own behavioural insight function. I believe that that is a stepping stone to a future world in which we don't necessarily need behavioural insight teams operating separately in different departments, because it's mainstreamed into the way in which civil servants think and act in the way that other disciplines might have been. So I think we're still on that path, but in the future it may well be that we don't think about behavioural insights in the way that we think about it now, as almost a separate thing from normal policy making.
And do you think it's been mainstreamed in the World Bank?
I think we're on our way. I think I very much appreciated the way you put that question. When it comes to some of the policy challenges we all face, like increasing savings among people, formal and informal sector, if you go to a developing country, to in some municipality somewhere in the interior, and you ask someone, how would you do this? They would say, well, you could subsidize. It's top of mind because of the way we've been doing graduate training for many, many years. You can use information and you can use subsidies, maybe taxes, but it's not top of mind to say, give them a lockbox, here's mental accounting. I think that our long-term goal is to, how do we get that person, in the interior of Brazil 30 years from now to have that top of mind? And we need to make it salient. We need to include it in our education programs when students go through their training programs. And we need to help people encounter what it's like not to have savings. We sort of give people that own experiential understanding. So I think it's education, it's salience within the institution, and it's sort of the actual experience of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. But I think we have quite a ways to go.
Andrea, I had the feeling in the UK that trying to get this across to politicians, their behavioural bias was that they always, because they went to Parliament all the time, it was all about legislation. So if there was a problem, let's legislate, let's regulate, as opposed to let's think about behavioural change. Did you have the same?
Yeah, it's a reflection in the public service as well. We are perfect in setting up consistent pieces of law, regulations, from paragraph 1 to paragraph 17, or most of the time 117. It's very consistent, it's very well done, there's a lot of competence going in there. But that's only part of the story. It's really starting with having a clear understanding of the problem, of everybody involved, having an idea of how to deal with it and deal with it from different angles, not only from the legal angle, does it really work? Did we look at intended consequences, but also unintended consequences? What shows up, what we didn't expect? Did we really have only one target group or more target group? Who are the winners and losers? So the process gets bigger and more complex, and just by bringing in people who have different sets of competences, we can be very supportive to. Most of the time in the German system, it's really lawyers who are sitting at the desks and being supportive, but by asking questions. What do you know about the causes? What do you have in mind as an idea? What angle have you been looking at? So just by asking questions, we're already helpful. And stress, making a point that this is a real complex series of processes which need different competences is helpful in itself. So where we end up in the end, hopefully, is really to change a bit the evaluation culture or the culture how we solve problems. So we shift the focus from good legislation to good problem solving.
Sim, you mentioned the point about academic departments and making it realistic. And one of the issues I think that I think we face in the Behavioural Insights team, and surprisingly I've found in universities. So I used to think government departments were completely siloed. They wouldn't talk to each other. Then I dealt with universities. Trying to get the different disciplines together. I'd be interested in if you've got any insights into that, and also how, for people running Behavioural Insights teams and the like, what's the mix of skills that we should have? How many economists, psychologists, who are the most, I know we need people that understand government, but what else do we need?
Well, I think there are two aspects to this. One is, I know at BSPA, the way we've approached it is there is a part of our organization that's based around the disciplines, because to assess the rigor of the research requires some of that. However, to make it useful, it needs to be centered around the problems. It's not driven by the issue that a disciplinary perspective highlights. Yesterday, this was raised in terms of it's about life. It's not about the literature. And I think that's right. What is the real question? Because real life questions tend to be interdisciplinary. They tend not to fall in the disciplinary categories. And so when you get people to focus on the problem, it inherently is interdisciplinary. I also think that if we can change the mindset of the academics and some of the incentive systems for the academics, what will come out is the more interesting, the more nuanced, the deeper kinds of insights that come for the disciplines themselves will come from these interdisciplinary kinds of problems. But we've got to make it easier for them to do that. We've got to make the incentive system work for them to do that, because just like everybody else, academics are not naive.
Okay.
And they do respond to their context.
But make it easy, it's kind of principle
Yes.
number one. Oh.
Yeah, I was just going to tell a story about the naming of the Behavioural Insights team, which I think gets to this point. So we were conscious of the fact that if we called ourselves the Behavioural Economics team, for example, we would offend psychologists and prevent them from collaborating. We were also conscious that if we called ourselves the Behavioural Science team, we would go around and people would say, this is the BS team coming along, and that wasn't going to help us out much. But the reason that we went for Behavioural Insights was because it was a neutral term, and it enabled us to then collaborate with lots and lots of people who didn't think that this was loaded for or against them. And for us, that was really important.
Did you want to come in on this? So in the World Bank, I mean, you've got a lot of different professionals there. How do you get them all on the same page?
We have a lot of different professionals who are sold on the idea of evaluation. That's something that I think people have been doing in development for some time. I think that the little change we need to make for us is that we need sort of quicker and faster evaluations. And I think we have a culture of economists, and we tend to be influenced by the Poverty Action Lab and others and our own units like that do, big data collection, multi-arm trials, and then you do follow-up 3 or 4 years later, which is great. We need that for publication. But I think our challenge is, if we're going to use it within a project, within a program, we need more real-time data. And I think people aren't necessarily trained in that because many of them are PhD economists who have been aiming for publication. So I think that's the culture shift we're aiming for.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have to keep this going at pace. So I'm now going to bring on 3 more speakers who are going to talk us through various different examples. First of all, we've got Faisal Naru from the OECD, who's going to talk about regulators. I'm just going to mention the 3 of you, then come up and speak in turn. Then Amity Durham from New South Wales, Executive Director for Behavioural Science, is going to talk about the issues there in the States. And then Ping Soon, Deputy Secretary of the Ministry of Manpower in Singapore. And hopefully we'll get that kind of cultural bias. I know there's a book out there, Jonathan Haidt's book, where one of his quotes is about the problems of having, is another good mnemonic, the evidence which is weird, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic societies, and that we need to get a broader evidence base. And so I'm hoping in this session we'll get the Australasian view as well. Faisal, over to you. Please all come up and we'll use the lectern one by one.
Thank you, Gus. Well, I feel like firstly I should probably start off by I'm not going to talk about apples or pears or anything, but I am going to talk about beards, and I did want to go on the record first of all for saying that I, for one, like Owain's beard, and I think that you look quite good in it compared to before. But of course. But of course, that's all right. But of course, that is not the official opinion of the OECD, and that is only my own personal opinion of Owain. But I guess you can probably spot the bias. Right. So the OECD. Well, I was going to speak about regulators, and then I was listening to things, and I kind of tore up what I was going to say and kind of change it slightly around. The OECD has had quite a bit of a history in looking into behavioural economics. Firstly, and the application of it, or I should say Behavioural Insights, and it started off looking at it sectorally in different fields: health, tax, environment. There's a great study by Nick Johnston on default settings in buildings for reducing environmental impacts. But I guess the angle that I'm looking at it is probably much more from a public policy angle of what does it actually mean in terms of public policy. And I've been looking at, well, what is really going on? What is going on across the world in relation to behavioural insights? And I guess I probably wanted to have three messages, and probably three messages for the three sets of groups of people, hopefully, that are within the audience. I think firstly for governments, well, what is going on? Well, I guess the message is that many people are doing it, and more people are doing it now. Back in January, we had a very big conference, which we were quite amazed at the number of. We ended up having about 150 people from different governments, from different regulators, from different public institutions, academics, coming together and having a first meeting of practitioners of how is behavioural insights being conducted. The summary of which is available outside. It is for free. I won't autograph it. It'll probably devalue it. But I think, but please do have a look at that. But I think the message for governments is that this isn't something new that public institutions are doing. Regulators have been doing this for a much longer time. They have been interacting on markets, on looking at consumer behaviour. We had a great session earlier on in one of the parallel sessions where a lot of this was brought out. And regulators really have been looking at how consumers behave, because if they ultimately are the referees of the market, and they need to try and make sure that there is fair play. But in doing that, they don't necessarily want to intervene directly, and they have to look at, well, how can they try and change some behaviours? And there's some great examples, like in Colombia, where the telecommunications regulator used a combination of behavioural economics and game theory to change the behaviour of consumers to start to complain about bad service. And it worked. Service providers actually improved because of this, and they could have gone down the regulatory route, but they didn't. They went through a different route. The second message is for public officials, and I think this has partly been touched upon, but I think for public officials, it's that today a lot of the application of behavioural insights has been on what we call regulatory delivery or regulatory implementation. It's been on tweaking things and getting some good wins, or having some alternatives to regulation. I think there should probably be a bit more effort in relation to actually defining regulations in the first place, defining policies in the first place, defining public policy strategies in the first place. A big gaping, I guess, goal is the fact that there is so much rich information out there about behaviours that it can really help to define what the problem is in the first place, and then afterwards moving forward onto what is going on and how to address that is kind of secondary. The third message is probably for the behavioural scientists here, and this latches onto something that Owain started saying, which is to be linked and to be mainstreamed, to be linked to different kind of disciplines, because of many problems need multidisciplinary skills. So you think about the digital government, digital world, you think about the possible use of data analytics, but then become mainstreamed, and things like, and Andrea started to speak about this, but about the link between that and ex-ante impact assessments, public consultations that occur, helping to design those better, and training within civil service colleges as well. The very last thing that I'll say is that something that probably hasn't been touched on so much, but was certainly a key feature of this meeting, was about ethics. That ethics is a concern amongst most governments, and it's one of the primary concerns for beginning to go down this route. The message that the practitioners themselves got together and said is that yes, it is a concern, but it shouldn't be a constraint. and that transparency is going to be one of the key ways to try and address that issue and to ensure that behavioural insights isn't seen as some kind of a voodoo way of government working, but that it actually has some real benefits, and ultimately this is all about outcomes, and that's what governments are interested in, so that's what this should be about as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, Amity from New South Wales, tell us about what you've been up to.
Thank you. So, yes, I'm with the Department of Premier and Cabinet in New South Wales, and that's one of the states in Australia, for those who aren't familiar. I'm going to give you a short overview of the work that we've been doing and our history, and then a few observations on the success factors and perhaps some of our challenges going forward. So, look, we established a Behavioural Insights unit within our Department of Premier and Cabinet about 3 years ago, and it came from a keen interest of the Premier at the time, along with his staff and the Secretary of our department, and some senior officials as well across our agency. And I think that interest was spiked by, I guess, some of the successes in the UK with the BIT. And so quite quickly we decided we would form a partnership with BIT to bring in the skills, the knowledge, the experience of running trials on the ground and to test them in the Australian context. So quite quickly we got them on board. We put some of our own key policy staff within the unit, and we started a program of initiating some trials across government. We chose the areas of trials on the basis of a couple of things. One was we wanted to establish a pretty quick track record of wins to prove the concept within New South Wales. But secondly, we went where we knew that we had support in other parts of government, and we had the support of the executives, and they were willing to put in resources to run trials and test things. So some of the areas we started with were fines and traffic infringement penalty notices. So we've changed the letters and the communications. We looked at getting injured teachers back into work, so those that have been on workers' compensation. And just by changing processes and communications, we were able to achieve some really clear and quick wins and measure those. So we saw a 27% increase in teachers getting back to work within 90 days as a result of those interventions. And we did some hospital trials as well in the health system. So we looked at getting private patients to be admitted as a private patient in a public hospital. And in Australia, that means we can bring in additional revenue into our public system from private insurers. And by doing that, we were able to achieve $7 million in revenue just for one hospital alone from doing that work. And we've done some work in reducing missed appointments in outpatient services as well. So, look, we started with those areas. We were able to run trials, measure the results, and I think that's quite powerful and persuasive for government. But I think now we're at the point where we're being asked to think about more complex issues and more difficult social problems, and how we can use behavioural insights to inform and improve the services that we're delivering in those spaces and getting better outcomes for people and I guess better quality lives for people. So some of the areas we're looking at now are working in domestic violence, and we're designing some trials around offenders of domestic violence to reduce reoffending. We're running a trial on childhood obesity and working with children, getting them to make plans and running an RCT to test the effect of that. And we're also looking at social housing tenants and how to reduce rental arrears and them going into arrears, particularly at Christmas. And from here, I think where we're at, we've, I guess, proved the concept. We've been able to receive additional funding centrally, so we're growing our unit, and we're going to be running trials in more areas across government, like transport congestion, regulation, some more in offending, and perhaps around engagement in education as well. So out of all of that, some of the key success factors I think we've seen, I mean, I'll probably just stick with the apples because it pretty much reflects our experience as well. I think it's really important to, as I said, focus on some quick wins early on and be able to measure the results and really prove the case to ministers and senior executives that this is worthwhile to do. And in that way, having that support, that senior level support, is really important for the sustainability of the work going forward. The other thing we found is partnerships are really important. So we are a small team and we're relying on the contributions of our agencies, their knowledge and their resources. And we also spend quite a bit of time in designing trials with the frontline workers as well. So it really is a collaborative effort to design it, to run it, and then and the last thing we find is really working is awareness raising. So we spend quite a bit of time designing masterclasses that we run for public officials across government. I think we've trained nearly 1,000 public officials, and we've established a community of practice. So that's an online community of practice where we can share the results of trials and I guess build general awareness about the value of using behavioural insights in policy design and in improving services. I think going forward, some of the challenges we're facing is how you take the trial results and you make them system-wide. So in health, I think we've proved the concept within certain hospitals, but we have a devolved health system with a lot of local health districts, so it's thinking about how you can institutionalise that in that kind of health system when there are so many players, so many decision makers. So it is about relationships, I think, and collaboration, which we're continuing to work on. I think as well as we move into the more complex areas around human behaviour, we're finding we need to spend more time on trial design. We need to spend more time with a broader range of actors and really make sure that what we're doing is going to work. So going forward, we're trying to balance some of that with some other more simple trials, so we get a good mix of results. And the things that take a bit longer to get going, we're continuing to run shorter trials that we have a steady stream of learning and a steady stream of results. And I think that's it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, finally, Ping Soon, who's Deputy General,
Secretary, not General.
Deputy Secretary in the Ministry of Manpower in Singapore, who have been very leading users.
I wouldn't claim to be there. Yeah. Thank you, Gus. I think Gus started by talking about cultural differences. What I observe is that most Western speakers, when they start their presentation, they'll start with a joke. Asian speakers typically start their presentation with an apology. So I'm going to start with a confession. And my confession is really that I am no expert in BI sciences and methodologies. And certainly attending 2 days of behavior exchange ain't going to make me one. And as the saying goes, a little knowledge is a dangerous thing. So I'm going to limit my sharing over the next 5 minutes on a set of reflections on this subject from the perspective of a policymaker. And the problem sometimes with being the last speaker is that many of the lessons and reflections I have are probably already shared by some of my earlier speakers. So please bear with me. Now, as I learned from Behavioural Insights, the first thing that's important to do is to set the context. And to set the context in the Ministry of Manpower, our mission is really to develop a productive workforce and progressive workplaces so that we can help Singaporeans get better jobs, higher incomes, and a more secure retirement. And we do our work in 4 roles. As a typical ministry, we have a policy formulation role, that's quite clear. We also take on a promotion role, particularly on practices which we are not able to legislate or mandate. We have an operations role, because we administer the whole work pass systems. And finally, we have a regulatory role. And my first reflection is this, is be very clear about the big goals of the organization. And I think that is very important, because a lot of times we get bombarded with new ideas, new process, new technologies that proves to be, or not proves to be, or at least promise to change the world in terms of policy making and public service delivery. So we've got to be very careful before we embrace some of these new ideas, new technologies, and new processes. For Ministry of Manpower, our big goals hasn't changed, but what has changed are the circumstances around it. And there are 3. Number 1, our policy making environment is getting more complex as we have to deal with different competing needs and different facets of that needs. Number 2, our citizens are getting more demanding. They're getting more demanding, particularly as we started to tighten some of our work process policies to tighten our foreign manpower. And number three, as Singapore moves into a more manpower lean economy, we are finding difficulty in terms of resources, in terms of hiring additional officers to staff some of our work. In short, we have to do more with less. And there are two consequences as a result of these challenges on our public service delivery. First, I think we are finding that we're increasingly having lower customer satisfaction as they deal with some of the services that we provide. And number two, the demand of our services have to increase. And to give you some sense of it, we receive about 2.5 million calls a year to our call center, over 200,000 case-specific emails, and we process over 1 million work passes every year, of which many we have to reject. So BI came at a time, in a very opportune time, because we were still struggling and thinking through what we can do to improve and optimize our public service delivery in a very optimal manner. We were at a stage of trying to transform the organization to be able to be more trusted and to be more citizen-centric as we design our policies and programs towards the citizens. So it came at an opportune time. So we think BI can do something about it, but how are we going to go about it? And that's my second reflection. And the second reflection is look for leverage points. Where is the leverage point where you can have a multiplier effect on the efforts that you're putting in? And for us, the leverage point was our work pass division, which, as its name suggests, was an administrator of the work passes. It was a natural candidate for us because since 2009, our work pass division has been working with IDEO in using design thinking in terms of re-examining the way our physical spaces and our work processes are designed to serve the needs of our employment pass holders. So it is not difficult to sell them to give BI a try because although both disciplines are slightly different, they are anchored on the same thing, which is human centricity. So we got them, we worked with them, to first of all do a very simple set of trials to basically change the letters they've been using to ask employers to pay some of their levies promptly. We use salience by making it very clearly what are actions they have to take. We use social norms to remind them that 96% of employers pay their fines, pay their levies promptly. We do prompting, by printing the letters on pink letters, which is a very Singaporean thing, because all government fines, letters on government fines go out in red letters, so we print it on pink. And we personalize the letters by putting the names of the affected foreign workers right on the letter. And of course, we run RCTs. Now, the project worked. And the project worked not because we got the group of officers the existing group of officers in our work pass division to do it. And that's my third reflection. It works because we gathered a group of what I call fire starters. We scoured the whole ministry for a group of high potential officers, selected not just because they're high potential, but because they have the tenacity and the understanding of different lines of business in the organization. And we got them to do and drive the project. Their task was to make the project so easy that what the boss of the work pass division has to do is to say yes. So they did most of the heavy lifting. And they also make it easy for the operations team to support. So when the operations team eventually said that, yeah, I like the new design letter, but I'm going to need 6 months because I need to put up a service request so that the templates of the letters can be changed, we said, no way. So what we did was we get the small team of people to manually print out the 1,000 letters and send it out for the first trial. So that worked. So do a lot of heavy lifting for that. So it's important to gather that group of fire starters. Of course, we know that a group of fire starters ain't enough to boil the whole ocean. So my fourth reflection is really to plant many seeds and keep watering them. And there's 3 ways to do it in terms of planting more seeds and keep watering them. First is to look for opportunities for small wins. We know that changing letters was an easy way to start. So why stop at 1 when we have actually 1,000 over letters that we send, templatized letters that we send? So what do? We ran a letter writing competition. So we decided to gamify the whole process, make it incentivize the process, and we just get ordinary mummers, which are what we call ourselves affectionately, to come on board to show how easy it is to actually apply behavioral insights to it. Number 2, we try to find new allies. In order to find new allies, we plug in our behavioral design unit to have a seat around the senior management table and get them to think about and identify what are some of the business or customer problems that the divisions are facing so we can inject them straight into the problem identification and solving stage. And the third thing we do in this reflection is really to see how we can change the language in which some of these methodologies are being used. It is important, as one of the speakers say, that we debunk the idea that this is some voodoo or some black magic, that only a small group of people knows that. So we started to infuse the language of mind, space, and ease into the daily lingo of our mummers, so that whenever any mummers are being asked to review policies or develop programs, not just public policies, by the way, but internal policies. For example, how do we increase contributions to charitable organizations? How do we increase participation rate to some of our own events? We get them to apply that, so it's make it much easier for them. And now we have increased that and kick it up another notch by infusing some of the principles of insight into the DNA of the organization, by changing the set of service principles. We are trying to achieve excellence in public service delivery. So we have infused some of this into a set of new service principles. I don't have the acronym by the name of a fruit, but I have an acronym by the name of a body part. Because service excellence is about serving with heart, H-E-A-R-T. So for us, HEART stands for hear them out, make it easy, anticipate their needs, respect every individual, be timely. So that's HEART. And as you can see from the way I've described HEART, some of the principles of behavioral insights is actually infused into it. My final reflection is, I think has been said by Owen, develop a network. The reality is that I have only a very small behavioral design unit, but beyond the behavioral design unit, we have seen set up a community of practice within the Ministry of Manpower, which we call Design Works, comprising about 30 to 40 odd officers. We feed them very well, we train them, and we get them involved in the over 20 projects that we are currently running. Number two, outside of the Ministry of Manpower, we've been working with the Public Service Division, as well as Civil Service College, to encourage and seed the setup of many of these units across the government, and there's a community of practice to bring these practitioners together. So it's no surprise that we have over 20 Singaporean officials right here attending this conference, despite the general election happening right now. And they come from a wide variety of agencies. And number three, in terms of networks, outside of Singapore, we work very closely with our partners. And here, I'm very grateful for the support by the Behavioural Insights team, who have been with us since day one in building up the capabilities in the Ministry of Manpower to do that. And we continue to look for new opportunities. In fact, we have embedded one of our fire starters into the unit, I think Halpern, which is sitting there. One of our early fire starters are now spending about 3 to 4 months in the Behavioural Insights teams. So we continue to look for new opportunities to collaborate so that we can deepen our capabilities and tackle the bigger challenges. So those are my 5 challenges. And in case you think through my reflections that we have a grand plan when we started this journey, let me disabuse use of that. We don't have a grand plan. And I like to use a very commonly used Chinese saying, which I'll translate into English, which essentially means crossing the river by touching the stones. Which is a nice way of saying that you just do things one step at a time and figure things out along the way, which I suppose keeps up with the spirit of Behavioural Insights, which is about understanding things, designing, and always testing. So thank you for your time.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So if there's one thing you go away from there is have a heart. Remember the heart, remember the apples. And also one thing that Ping mentioned there, very, very important, the fact that he referred to it as more for less. And basically there are very, very few governments represented here who aren't going through a period of trying to reduce your government deficits. I remember 2010 when we were starting up, the government was going to cut the deficit from 11% of GDP, halve it in well, actually they're going to do slightly more than halve it, but they halved it anyway. We changed more for less to better for less because we probably couldn't do more given the numbers that were coming down. But it is the kind of necessity is the mother of invention. So when people said we really want to keep up or improve the quality of public services, and yet we know our budget is going to go down by 20%, boy, do you get someone who is desperate to find new, interesting ways of delivering those public services. And curiously enough, Behavioural Insights can give you really good ways of meeting that gap. Right, enough from me. This is your turn. You've been, this is the reciprocal part. We've done our bit. We're going to sit back and just chill, as they say, and you are now going to come up with some brilliant questions. So Nick in the front.
Nick Chater, Warwick Business School and Decision Technology. I wanted to pick up on the question of how we can get the whole world to think from a behavioural point of view. And I wonder if it already does. The only place that that's not the case is inside professions which have been trained in law or in economics. So if you think about most people trying to sell stuff in the world, they're thinking behaviourally all the time. So one way in which theory, even a bit of theory, can be really dangerous is that if you imagine taking a rational choice perspective on the gambling industry, you think, well, that industry is totally doomed because people are risk averse. And actually, if you learn a bit about psychology, you think, oh, they're loss averse as well. Well, this industry is completely dead. In fact, it's obviously one of the most pervasive industries for thousands of years. So, and people have not figured out how to create money out of gambling by lots of psychological expertise. They've invented it using behavioural insights that they have within them. and copying other insights that work. So I think we shouldn't be pessimistic, actually. I think if we're trying to make better policy, a lot of the time, it's using our natural ability to think as individuals, to use our own intuitions about how we work, how the people around us work, and not block those by trying to put them within the framework that that is normally the framework for policy.
Too many experts. I mean, we need more. I think that Steven Pinker was saying, actually, the person over your shoulder is the member of the public, and you should be thinking about how they will see what you do and actually getting them to test out what you do. So I think that's quite a good message. Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, right? Just very quickly, and we should probably say Nick is also on the Behavioural Insights team academic advisory panel. I think that's right to an extent. The number one lesson that we always emphasize is if you want somebody to do something, make it easy for them to do the thing that you want them to do, which I think we all intuitively know and understand in our everyday lives. If we're thinking about the way that we might influence those around us, our children, we don't start by thinking, what's the financial incentive that I can put in place? But I think a lot of the results from our trials reveal that sometimes what you think might happen doesn't always happen. And so I think we should use our intuition more. We should use the intuition of those that we work with, those who administer services, who've often got brilliant ideas that aren't necessarily being scaled up. But we should also recognize that sometimes our intuition lets us down, and that's why the testing and trialing side of things is really important.
So Owen's telling you there, make gambling simpler. Is that? No, I don't think so. No, yes, go on.
Yeah, so I want to reinforce the idea that we should be recognizing that people understand behavior already. What people don't understand, though, that I think is part of this movement is evidence and the need to test their intuition against the evidence. And so, to my way of thinking, if we've really succeeded at this, individuals and organizations will much more routinely ask, show me the evidence, before something is adopted. And that's not part of the routine today. So I think we need to be very careful about what are we trying to achieve. And it's the analogy to in information technology. About 10, 15, 20 years ago, they referred to the goal of ubiquitous computing, where computing would not be a room filled with a machine, but it would be throughout our lives. What we want is ubiquitous evidence. We want everybody to routinely be able to access and think about the need for evidence before they make big decisions.
Okay, we have two. Varun and Faisal wanted to come in on this, but then we should get back to the audience.
I was going to say, I think that's absolutely right. I think for public institutions and public administration and public bodies, that what a lot of public officials end up doing is they end up being slaves to the process and the systems. Mm-hmm. And that's what we mean by kind of institutionalizing it. And that's why I think one of the ways is to try and ensure that the systems and processes themselves are somehow infiltrated better, like ex-ante impact assessments, like the public consultations that are carried out. By having some kind of influence on them, that will help to hopefully free up people to be people and not to be bureaucrats as such.
I very much agree with that. At the same time, for some of the very big problems we're facing worldwide, corruption, climate change, people understand this all too well. They know reciprocity. Someone gives you a gift, you owe them one back. That leads to patronage networks, that leads to corruption. Climate change, we tend to focus on ourselves and not think long-term, we're all discount. We need to actually get people to be a little bit less behavioral and a little bit more rational, thinking of the collective interest in some instances.
Okay, good point. Yes. So, okay, yeah, fine.
Steve Wills, Insight Management Academy. Yesterday, Daniel Kahneman said the next big thing was what he called the human engineering of decision making. And he was talking about how we actually change the decision processes within the organizations we're trying to influence. We've heard so much really good stuff about great techniques, great results, the importance of evidence, of random controlled trials, everything else. But are we not in danger of falling into the same traps that the economists fell into, of actually beginning to subconsciously assume that the decision makers we're trying to influence in our organizations are themselves econs? Should we not actually be applying our own techniques to ourselves? I know you talked about the peas in apples and so on, but actually being much more rigorous about applying it to ourselves to make sure that we are influencing the decision makers in the best way that we possibly can.
Okay, does anyone want to pick up on that? Yeah.
So we took very seriously this idea and did this survey of World Bank staff and showed ourselves that we ourselves have biases. We replicated the Kahneman-Tversky experiments. We found that World Bank staff think ideologically. With the help of the chief economist often at DFID, we did the experiment here and found DFID staff also think that way. I'm sure any organization would find this.
Yeah.
So there, one idea is to red team, sort of before you make a big decision, argue out both sides. I think DFID is trying that in a small way. We're going to try and do that kind of thing too in small ways, in our team. So I completely agree with that, and there are a variety of techniques out there to begin to improve decision making. It's not easy, but I think it's a crucial issue.
And I think one thing, we just shouldn't get carried away. I mean, the problem I would see about most government policies, and remember we said this, we're thinking about we test them all, we don't test them all. Most government policies just rolled out, and they're based on prior strong beliefs, not evidence. So, we're a long way from the frontier here. What we're talking about is, in fact, some of the behavioural stuff is by far the best stuff we have in government policy, and we need to, by example, push them and say, well, you did that in that area. What about thinking about that policy you're about to implement there, where that was in your manifesto, but do you really think it's going to achieve the outcome that you really want, and aren't there better ways? And that gets you into the kind of what works centres, is what does the evidence tell us? I think that's good. So we should get some more people in. Lady there, gentleman there. Yeah, far away.
Hi, Carl Purcell with the Irish Government. So we have done some RCTs, especially around the tax compliance side, and we have some kind of different issues. So we have two kind of issues, and I just wanted to get your opinions on how we might overcome them. The first is we have this example of where it has worked, but you bring it to, say, a manager in another section, you say, well, here is a result, it did work, and you still get this kind of resistance of, okay, but will this RCT type approach actually work in my department? And the second issue that we get is that there's a certain reluctance between from some senior management to publish the results for a fear of, okay, well, you're experimenting, that whole thing we've been talking about the whole time. So just I'd like to get your opinions on how we try and overcome those issues.
Fine. Do you want to? Amity, you were very successful in getting replication.
Yes, look, so in terms of our initial work on penalty notices and fines, I think we had a similar experience. We had a win there. There's been a bit of a break, but and we've now, I guess, regenerated some of that support, and we're going to go back in and do some more work. I mean, I think the reality is you have to build those relationships and I guess prove the case. It helps to use, obviously, evidence, but also to think about what the barriers are from their perspective as well. One of the things we've found quite helpful is we have a sharing approach to how you resource the trials. So some of it is centrally resourced, and then some is from the agencies. So in that way, you form a real partnership to do the work, because this isn't cost-free, doing this work, particularly when you start to go to scale, and it involves IT upgrades and things like that, even to do a simple letter trial. So I think it's kind of working through those issues in a collaborative way. We found that to be quite helpful.
Ping, you want to come in and then Sim?
Just two quick comments. I think I echo what she's been saying. Of course, from an organization point of view, we need to see how you can create a fail-safe environment, or rather, environment where they can fail very quickly and not be penalized for it. So in MOM, we try to create such an environment by ensuring that there's certain protected time and protected space for some of these activities to be taken on. And the reality is that operations teams are always being seized with their daily matters. So in order to do some of these experiments, we always see how we can augment them, with additional resources and to create a fail-safe environment. I just want to quickly respond to the earlier comment. I mean, on our part as policymakers, we're always asking ourselves, who's nudging the nudgers, right? So, of course, they have their own biases and all that. So, just to pick up on the thread on some of these other disciplines that can be involved, is we're trying to see how we can, for example, inject the use of business analytics and fuse that discipline into what we're doing for behavioral insights. In fact, I've been toying the idea that I wouldn't want to call it behavioral insights. For me, it's hybrid insights. Insights that you can draw from observing of human behavior as well as observing data, because the whole methodology of using business analytics also rests on understanding, design, and test. So what does the data tell us? Not just based on observation of it. So I'll give you a very quick example of what we are trying to do. It's still in early stages. So and the problem here is how can I drive service demand? how can we move to a state, where I can get self-service by default and move channels away, to self-service. So that was a big goal. And how do we go about doing that? So we, as I said, with 2.5 million calls, we process 1 million over applications. So we use business analytics, to mine through the data and ask the data to tell us through their own cluster regression and all that, what are the type of archetypes of people that tells me? I have no preconceived notion, just what are they calling me for, use text analytics to do clustering, go through and match the callers with the back-end admin data and just tell me who are the type of people who call me. So through the predictive modeling, they came up with certain of these archetypes. And then I apply design thinking principles, right? I try to find some of these representative people who are form of the archetype, and I do deep interview, ethnographic interviews and all that to see that out. And once I do that, then I apply BI interventions to see what I can do to nudge them away from calling me to some of my self-service channels. And then I do RCT to test whether the interventions work. So I think it's really a use of a different set of different methodologies to serve the larger outcome.
Thank you. Sim.
Let me start off with a Singaporean apology and confession that I think part of the problem is also the science itself, in that in the sciences, it is very hard to get any rewards for replicating studies in a different environment. So if it was done in education and now it's being applied to healthcare, you can't publish that in top scientific journals today because we already know that's the case. You don't have to replicate it in another environment. But to your point, the people in healthcare aren't going to accept it when it's been done in education, but it hasn't been done in their environment. The good news is it is starting to change in science, and there is more of an emphasis on replication and an allowance for replication in different contexts as actually being new information. So there is some reason for optimism, but today, the problem you're describing is not only on the practitioner side, it's also on the scientist side. And science hasn't changed yet.
Okay, thanks. Yes.
Hi, I'm Lily Jempel from London Business School. So as a behavioral scientist, I'm obviously very excited that organizations are starting to employ more behavioral insights into their organizations and even build their own teams. And I, of course, appreciate that we need a new infrastructure and a pipeline to be able to communicate between things like academia and these organizations. But what I'm worried about is the directionality of the flow of information. And I recently had an experience when I was at Google and I was giving a talk, and I had people come up to me who worked there and said, oh, we've done that study a million times here, and we've gotten these and these and these results, but it's not something I would have ever known about because they are so internal, they keep all that information just for their organization. So I'm curious about your thoughts, several of you, about how to make sure the directionality is not one way.
Okay. Can I make a really quick comment on that? That I think that's exactly right, and that's why I think focusing on the problem, not just the disciplinary insights, not just the literature, but the life, is really critical. The metaphor we use for that infrastructure is it's a bridge, but a bridge has to have cars flowing in both directions. And right now, scientists tend to think about how science can inform practice, but has been raised here, is a lot of times the problems have been solved in practice, and the science is catching up. So I think it's critical that it be viewed in both directions.
Okay, there's a lady there at the front.
Hello, I run one of those little insight units in a department, and I have a couple of questions. One, the quick wins that make everything work more smoothly tend to be around comms and communications. And that's a double-edged sword because I don't know if this is the same in other countries, but at the moment, communications can sometimes be at the periphery of policy making rather than kind of at the heart. And how are we going to take that from being a sort of trivial tweaking around the landing of something to actually using insights to decide what it is we do, not just how we land what we do? And when that leads you to asking some of the bigger questions, what advice have you got for when those questions come up with answers that people don't really want?
Okay. Owen, do you want to start?
Yeah, so I think you're right. A lot of the quick wins have focused on communications. To my mind, though, the problem is thinking about it as communication rather than thinking about it as policy making. And I say that because certainly in the UK government, we have lots of people who do comms who don't think that their role is to achieve a government objective, they think that their role is to explain what government is doing in a particular area and to do responsive press briefing. So I think it's about changing the mindsets of communicators so that they are actively engaged in the policy-making process. And to my mind, one of the really, really interesting parts in the sort of history of the Behavioural Insights team was when, for those of us, myself included, I mentioned that I used to work in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. So did Rory Gallagher, who's sat on the front bench here. And we used to do big strategic thinking. And the big change for us was when we started to realise that the letter sent from the tax authority, engaging in that could actually be really interesting and could actually influence people's behaviour. So I think it's about rethinking comms.
Okay, yeah, Amity, quickly, we're running out of time, so.
I would quickly add to that. I think the other part of shifting it is moving it more to the front line of service delivery. So it's at when the service interacts with the person, and how does that conversation go, and how do you work with that person around setting goals or commitments. So it's sort of taking it from letter communication to all forms of communication, interaction with people and clients. And I think you can still achieve some, probably not quick wins, but medium-term wins if you work really closely with your frontline staff and your clients and consumers, and I guess then refine that practice about how services are delivered. And I think we're moving in that space.
Faisal and Varun, you've got 15 seconds each.
All right, very quickly, instead of just looking at what you should do, what about looking at what the problem is in the first instance and applying behavioural insights into that? Because I've got 15 seconds, just quickly, on the other question, the OECD, we're going to be collecting the kind of infrastructure that you're talking about. We're kind of set up to have that. We're going to be collecting that and having a follow-up to this meeting where that can kind of start to happen as well. So 15 seconds up.
On this question of two-way communication from practitioners back to the scientific community, there's a lot of tacit knowledge in the hands of practitioners who've been doing behavioral insights, who've been doing political economy for many years without knowing it, right? Speaking, what was Moliere, sort of, oh, I speak prose, what a revelation, I didn't realize that. So we need analytic case studies for that knowledge. We need RCTs, we should all do them, but I think we need to be careful to keep in mind that there are other kinds of very useful knowledge out there that we need to collect.
Fine. Now, it's my job to round it all up. Just to say, I hope at the end of this you will all think about going forth and nudging and sorting out precisely how to make it happen, as opposed to just thinking about it and writing nice papers. It's really about, are you improving people's lives sustainably? That's hugely important. And if you ask yourself about the ethics, it's always that. Will this lead to a long-term sustainable improvement in people's well-being, and are the means reasonable means? Those two things. My final point is to say a huge thank you to this enormously talented panel who are making things happen around the world and for whom I am very grateful. Thank you.